Hi, welcome back. We have so far studied from Genesis to 2 Samuel, and may we start the synopsis of the books of 1 Kings and the 2 Kings. You know what? In the original Hebrew Bible, the books of 1 Kings and the 2 Kings are but one. They are just one book. It's called the Book of Kings. But in our Bibles, we have the 1 Kings and the 2 Kings, which is good because the huge volume has been divided into two, and it's easy for us to learn. Let me tell you what these two books cover. When you start looking at the book of 1 Kings, you would see that by now David is old. He is about to die. And who was going to succeed him to the throne as the next king? We know that Saul ruled for 40 years and David ruled for 40 years, and then now the son of David is going to become the next king. You will see how there were some minor problems. When you read, you will see that some fellows wanted to become the king like Adonijah, but then God's choice was Solomon. God made Solomon to succeed the throne of David. Solomon becomes the king and rules for 40 years. So you will read all about how in the old age David died a peaceful death, and then how Solomon ascended the throne, and the many exploits of Solomon. And we all know that Solomon had his good side and the bad side. Of course, when God appeared to Solomon and said, "Hey, what would you want from me?" Instead of asking for money or fame, he asked for wisdom, thereby impressing God. And God said, "Oh boy, I'm so impressed. I'm going to give you what you asked. I'm going to give you immense wisdom so that nobody before you or after you would be wiser than you. But I will also give you the things that you did not ask, such as fame and wealth." Solomon became very wealthy. And when you have a lot of money and a lot of fame, then automatically you would start attracting women. And this guy attracted women in a very huge fashion, lock, stock and barrel. He ended up marrying 700 wives and having 300 concubines. He did not just get wives from within Israel, but without, even from Egypt, Syria, and where not. He was such an attraction to many people. But then that was the cause of his demise. If you go to the 6th chapter, it will say how these wives of King Solomon caused him to backslide. Solomon's story starts in a bright manner but ends in a very bleak way. He was so spiritual, he built the temple for God. David wanted to build a temple, and God was impressed with the idea. The location was wonderful, Mount Moriah, Araunah's field. David purchased that land, great. The plan was good, everything was fine, but David was a man of war. He had shed a lot of blood. So God told David, "Your idea is wonderful. I will build a temple, but not through you, but through your son." And Solomon ended up building, a wonderful, wonderful temple. Scholars say that the amount of wealth he used, the amount of gold, silver, bronze, and the logs, the lumber, everything that he used, there is not even today, not a single building or a complex which has been built with such a lot of money. Amazing structure, amazingly rich. And Solomon built such a glorious temple, and he consecrated it to God, and God's presence descended upon that temple. And then Solomon was used by God to write some books. Some of those proverbs, when we talk about proverbs, I will remind this to you, were written by Solomon. Some of the Psalms were written by Solomon. Okay, and the book of Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon, and the book of Song of Solomon was written by Solomon. He was one of the biblical human authors. So spiritual was he. But what happened? When he grew old, his wives caused his heart to sway from God to other gods. In order to please his wives, he started building temples for those gods that his wives worshipped. And I don't believe he made it to heaven, okay? Because the Bible, which says that he backslid, doesn't say that he came back to God. Backsliding is a negative thing, and if the Bible took the trouble to mention that, it should have taken the trouble of inscribing that he came back to God had he come back. So I don't think he came back to God. Anyway, Solomon made God very sad, and God appeared to Solomon and said, I am very upset with you. I am going to rip the kingdom of Israel into two. But because I love David so much, your dad, I don't want to rip this nation during your time because of my love for David and because of what I had told David. But Solomon, when your son ascends the throne, this nation is going to be ripped into two. And that happened, my dear friends. You will read about that in 1 Kings. After the death of Solomon, Solomon's son Rehoboam ascends the throne. But he has some young friends who gave him the wrong advice. Let me tell you briefly what wrong advice was that. When Rehoboam became the king, people approached him and said, your dad, King Solomon, had imposed a lot of taxes on us. Why? Although Solomon was wealthy, he had 1,000 official women to look after, 700 wives and 300 concubines. And people like you and I who have one wife, we know how expensive it is. Okay? To have a lot of wives involves a lot of expenditure. And somebody told me, now don't ask me how I know this, but somebody told me that having concubines is much more expensive than having wives. Because to the wife you can say no, but to the concubine you cannot say no, because if you say no, she would become a concubine of somebody else. So if you want to keep your concubines, you need to spend a lot. Said someone to me, now don't ask me how I know this, okay? Now, this guy had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Obviously, he needed a lot of money on top of all the wealth that he had and his father had acquired for him. So he imposed a lot of taxes. But now that he's gone, these people were only too right in approaching King Rehoboam and saying, Sir, sire, could you kindly remove all these taxes? This guy says, okay, give me a couple of days, give me 3 days and I'll come back with the answer. And he asks his counselors, who were actually the counselors of his father. And they said, what these people are saying is true, sire. It's good if you reduce the taxes. But this fellow makes a wrong decision by consulting his friends. Okay? Why do you think it happened? Or why do you think God allowed it? Because God wanted to allow the nation to be ripped into two because of what Solomon did. So when he approached his young friends, the friends said, no, Rehoboam, if you give in to the requests of the people now, they will then start to dictate terms to you. Show them who you are. Go and tell them that you are thumb is thicker than the thigh of your dad. Ooh, it sounded so glorious, manly. And this guy went to Bethel and he told the people what the friends said. He said, no, I'm not reducing the taxes. On the contrary, I'm going to increase the taxes. Much to the dismay of those people. You know what they did? They nearly killed this guy. He ran for his life all the way from Bethel to Jerusalem. He landed in Jerusalem, and the people from the north side, from Bethel upwards, they got down a rebel called Jeroboam, who was a rebel during the time of King Solomon. He had fled Israel and gone and taken refuge in Egypt. These people got that guy to come back and appointed him as their king. The nation was divided into two. Now we all know that the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, are of 12 tribes. Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, the grandson of David, ended up having only 2 tribes, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. 10 tribes left them, and they appointed their own king, Jeroboam, and they, until the day they were destroyed, existed as Israel. Okay? Now, if you look at the whole nation of Israel under Saul and David, the northern boundary was Dan and the southern boundary was Beersheba. But now that the land is divided into two, the northern kingdom had its northern boundary Dan, as we already know, and their southern boundary became Bethel. So from Dan to Bethel became the nation of Israel. And Jeroboam, the first king of that divided Israel, erected 2 shrines, 2 temples to heathen gods. The god called Opus from Egypt, the golden calf. Remember Exodus 32? The same idol. 2 shrines, one in Dan and one in Bethel, so that the people of this northern kingdom would not be tempted to go to Jerusalem during feasts and festivals. Why? Because if these people go, perhaps they can repent. Perhaps they can compare me with the son of Solomon. Anyway, Rehoboam is the rightful heir to the throne. So they may repent and get themselves reconciled with King Rehoboam, and then I'll be gone. So in order to prevent the people from going to Jerusalem, he erected these 2 shrines, thereby leading the entire northern kingdom, consisting of 10 tribes, into idolatry. Okay? And when you read the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, every time you hit the words Ephraim or Israel or Samaria, it refers, these connotations refer to the northern kingdom of Israel. They continued to be called Israel because they were the majority. 10 out of 12 in the north. So they continued to call themselves Israel. But then let's look at the south. Rehoboam got only 2 tribes to rule, his own tribe, the tribe of Judah, and Benjamin. So the tribes of Judah and Benjamin became the southern kingdom, and they discontinued using the name Israel, and they started calling themselves the kingdom of Judah. So my dear friends, after Solomon, when you read the books of 1st and the 2nd Kings, if you see the expression Israel, remember it refers only to the northern kingdom. Whenever it says Judah, then that is talking about the southern kingdom. So the northern kingdom with 10 tribes from Dan to Bethel, and the southern kingdom of Judah from below Bethel all the way to Beersheba, having Jerusalem as its continued capital. Okay. Now let's start talking about the northern kingdom a little bit more. From the time they separated from Rehoboam, they continued as a nation until the year 722 BC. Okay, so this story happens around 930 BC, Solomon and the division of the land. So we are talking about around 200 or 220 years of existence of the northern kingdom until they were captured by Assyria and they were dispersed throughout the Assyrian world. Okay, so you will read about 19 kings starting from Jeroboam all the way to a king called Hoshea. Now don't confuse Hoshea with the prophet Hosea, about who we will talk later on in our series. He was Hosea. Hosea was a common name. You know, Joshua, Hosea, Josiah, Isaiah. These are all Uzziah. These are all the same name with different pronunciation, meaning the Lord is our salvation. Okay, so these are common names. So don't confuse the last king of the northern kingdom, Hoshea, to the prophet Hosea. Okay, 19 kings from Jeroboam to Hoshea. But remember, these did not come from the tribe of Judah. They are not descendants of David. Okay, they just became kings, and sometimes at times a king's son became a king, but then somebody else would come and slay this guy and he would become a king. So it was a very unorderly existence up in the north. They were full of idolatry and full of sin. Oh, God hated the northern kingdom of 10 tribes. Okay, and in 722 BC, God allowed the Assyrians to come and completely destroy the 10 tribes and take them and scatter them throughout the Assyrian world. Only a handful of people were left in their capital, Samaria, and the Assyrians brought other people from other conquered lands to Samaria, and these Jews who were left in Samaria intermarried them, and they became what we know as the Samaritans. Okay, so that's the northern kingdom. What about the southern kingdom? The southern kingdom was ruled by proper Davidic descendants, because God had promised David that your kingdom will be there forever. So God was graciously allowing the Davidic descendants to ascend the throne, starting from Rehoboam all the way down to the king called Zedekiah. There were 20 kings who ruled from Rehoboam to Zedekiah. Of the 20 kings, you will come across good kings, just 6 of them. Jehoshaphat, okay, then you will see Uzziah, okay, Josiah, Hezekiah. So these are some of the good kings who you would read about in the book of Kings, who would destroy the high places, who would destroy idolatry, who would bring the nation back to God, and who would be working good with prophets, so on and so forth. But 14 out of those 20 kings were evil. They forgot God. They were not like David. They imported idols from foreign lands and they started worshipping idols. So all in all, if you look at their life from about 930 BC to 586 BC, you would see fluctuations in their spirituality. And some of those kings even befriended some of the Israel kings, the northern kings. Most of the time, the northern kings and the southern kings were waging war with each other. Now, my dear friends, here is a common expression that you would see in the book of Kings. You would see that when this guy was ruling Israel, that guy was ruling Judah. Now you know they're talking about the divided kingdom. So Israel went to war against Judah, or Judah went to war against Israel. But then sometimes the king of Israel would be a friend of the king of Judah. These are the things you will see in the book of Kings. Okay. Now, in 1 Kings, you will start to study about the old age of David. And then you will keep on reading about how David passes away peacefully, how Solomon becomes the king, and the 40 years of the reign of Solomon, and how Solomon makes good things and mistakes. Okay, he does a lot of good things, but then he makes grave and fatal mistakes. Okay, and then how after Solomon, Rehoboam ascends the throne only to be losing 10 tribes to Jeroboam, and then after that, all the way to the end of 2 Kings, you will keep on reading about what happened in the north, what happened in the south, how they were sometimes friendly with each other, but most of the time fighting with each other, and so on and so forth. And you will then see how the Assyrians would come, kings like Sennacherib, Shalmaneser. You will hit those Assyrian names, and how they came against Israel, and then they conquered Israel, the northern kingdom, and the northern kingdom comes to an end in 722 BC. But then the southern kingdom continues to exist. During King Hezekiah, you would read how Assyrians threatened Hezekiah also to capture the southern kingdom. Now that they had conquered the northern kingdom, conquering the southern kingdom would be peanuts. Simple. But prophet Isaiah comes to Hezekiah's aid. Hezekiah was a wonderful king. He prays, and how Sennacherib, the king of the Assyrians, was completely defeated by an angel of death. You would see all that. Beautiful stories are there. And then you would see how God was warning the southern kingdom also. Hey, you are also off track. There have been times when you were okay with me, but most of the time you are off track. So I'm going to punish you. I'm going to chastise you. I'm going to allow Babylonians to come and capture you. And these people don't listen. And eventually God stirs up the heart of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, who invades Judah, the southern kingdom, and they conquer these people. You would read three invasions of Babylon. In 609 BC, then 597 BC, and finally in 586 BC. So by the time you come to the end of 2 Kings, you will see that even the southern kingdom is taken captive to Babylon. Until next time, enjoy the books of 1 Kings and the 2 Kings. And next time, I'm going to tell you what about the books of 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles. They look almost the same as the books of Kings. So why repetition? Are they similar? Are they different? What? Next time. See you. Bye.